Hello, my name is Anna Cuccia and welcome to Gallery Teachers Masterclass. Today we're going to be talking about understanding and implementing differentiation. I'm a teacher trainer on CELTA and Delta courses, and I'm also a school governor in secondary education for the United Learning Trust. And my special interest is teaching and learning and curriculum. Okay, so before we get started, I'd like to set a pre-webinar challenge. Number one is the nasty one, is taking your phone and actually maybe getting out of your chair and putting it out of reach, too far for you to touch and see it. Because if you're anything like me, you're going to be using your phone to Google things or check messages. What I would really love you to do is have maybe some paper and a pen ready, because you will need to take some notes. And I've got a couple of little tasks I'd like you to do. So not just to sit passively and listen to me, but to interact with this webinar. So I'm just wondering if you can devote 30 minutes to focusing your attention right here. That's a challenge for me. Hopefully it will be less of a challenge for yourselves. Okay, so we're going to move straight on to just reminding ourselves of the reflective questions, because we need those in the back of our mind whilst we're thinking about differentiation. So the first question that I've thought about is how well you know your learners, and could you paint an accurate picture of the individuals in your classes? So you might want to just close your eyes, think about that, try to bring to mind the image of a particular learner, maybe even a group of learners, and really think, how much do you know about them? Now, the level of detail I'd like you to think about, maybe you know this very famous picture, La Gioconda, so Mona Lisa, which was painted by Leonardo da Vinci, and some people believe that he started it in 1503 and maybe didn't finish it until 1517. Because he claimed that he really wanted to know his subjects. Now, this was just a portrait of a rich man's wife, but he wanted to really get inside what made her tick to produce this amazing picture. So obviously, I don't want you to spend sort of 6 or 7 years thinking about your learners, but really thinking more deeply than perhaps you might normally. The second reflective question that I've got you to think about is a lady called Tomlinson. I'll talk a bit more about her in a moment. And she says, as it says on screen, to teach in only one way will inevitably benefit some students and disadvantage others. So my question to you is, are you aware who gets the most of your teaching and who dips out a bit? So for me, for example, I really like doing lots of things with visual, with movement, but maybe that's not something that appeals to all students. So I need to present material or look at material in different ways to appeal to everybody. And the final question is asking yourself whether or not, when you're planning lessons, if you regularly have flexi stages in your lesson plan. Now, if you don't know what that is, we'll be coming to it. If you do know, think about how often you actually do that. So I'd like you to bear in mind these 3 questions as we go along. So the first part, before we define differentiation, is looking at teacher standards. So the UK government has these, and as you can see, there are 8. So you might want to think, well, what is a standard of teaching? And these are the basic standards that teachers need to basically accomplish or do effectively in order to be good teachers. And if we just go through this list a moment, we've got the first one. I'm not going to read these out. You can read for yourselves. Here's the second one. The third. Number 4. Number 5. Number 6. 7. And 8. Now, you might think straight about whether or not you are required to do those in your particular kind of teaching, what some of those might entail, but which one of these do you think is the one that touches on differentiation? And moving this arrow, I'll show you that we are going to focus our attention on number 5. So I'd like to look at number 5 in more detail and unpack that a bit. So what is differentiation? So that number 5, according to the UK government, is adapting teaching to respond to the strengths and needs of all pupils, the key word being all. So if they've broken this down into smaller bullet points, so we'll have a look at these. The first one, knowing when and how to differentiate appropriately and using approaches which enable pupils to be taught effectively. So I've pulled the keywords out here, the knowing when and the how, and the having suitable approaches, which is what we're going to be discussing today. Next one, we've got having a secure understanding of how a range of factors can inhibit pupils' ability to learn and how best to overcome these. So again, today, we're going to be looking at how you anticipate problems and how you find and plan solutions. Demonstrating an awareness of the physical, social, and intellectual development of children, and know how to adapt teaching to support pupils' education at different stages of development. So this is about our awareness, understanding readiness. When is a child or an adult ready to move to the next stage? And that flexibility, the adaptation, which I'm going to think about as elasticity, and have the image of the elastic band, which you can pull, really stretch it, or you can make it much shorter. And the final point is having a clear understanding of the needs of all pupils, including those with special educational needs, those of high ability, those with English as an additional language, which is what we're focusing on in particular, those with disabilities, and be able to use and evaluate distinctive teaching approaches to engage and support them. So this is about the spotting needs and evaluating methodology. So all of these key areas are what we hope to be looking at in the webinar. Okay, let's move on. So the lady that I referred to in the second reflective question, Carol Ann Tomlinson, she's an American educator and she's a real differentiation guru. She's written a book called The Differentiated Classroom and Responding to the Needs of All Learners. And just have a look at her quote there. And I'd ask you at the same time to be mindful. Try not to Google. So Carol Ann Tomlinson has written a really good, a lot of really good things about how to differentiate. And she was doing this before the term differentiation was coined. But the key thing is this responding to needs of a particular student or small groups of students. So it's the individuals and not the collection, not our whole class. Now, in order to do what she wants us to do, we have got to change our mindset. And we've got 6 things here which can be teaching foci. We can consider whether we're thinking more about teaching or learning, progress or attainment, or testing or developing. And the key things that hopefully you will see is that learning is more important than us doing the teaching. The progress is more important than the result of a test. And the development of skills is more important than the testing of those skills. And we need to have those 3 areas quite key in our minds if we are going to differentiate effectively in the classroom. So let's start straight away looking at the practicalities of this. How do we get to know our learners? If we're to treat learners as individuals, we have to really know them, and we need to know them very, very well. So I'm going to reveal under this square some methods of doing that. And what I'd like you to do is read those methods and think to yourself, do I do any of these? When do I do these? How often do I do these? So here they are. Thinking about the first one, questionnaires. Do you or the school give the learners questionnaires, be they young children or adults? Do you survey parents or stakeholders if the person paying for the course is the stakeholder and therefore we need to know their thoughts? If it is an adult themselves, are we surveying what they really want? Does the school have a good system of data dropping? So that means that if your student is already in the system, can you look at previous results from tests, previous notes, comments that other teachers have made? Do you have access to that material? That's obviously not going to be available if you're teaching somebody for the first time. Liaising. In over 20 years of teacher training, it never fails to amaze me how little people liaise. If you're working in a state school teaching English, liaising also means going and talking to the science teacher, the maths teacher, the teacher of design technology. If you're working in a language school, has somebody else already taught that person? If they're completely new to the system, obviously you can't liaise, but many students do have prior background, and it's good to find out. We can chat informally with learners. So one thing I notice, particularly when we train on CELTA courses, is when people are new to teaching and very nervous and worried about their lessons, they sort of start the lesson straight away, and they often forget that informal chat, like, what did you do at the weekend? What did you watch on telly? Have you got any plans for next weekend? Maybe you're out in a playground or a break time where you bump into your student in town. Those little informal conversations can be really useful. And more so, it's listening and observing each person interacting with other learners in their class or group, and just keeping your ears and your eyes open for what information you can collect. So how can we actually gather that data? So one thing I really like is it comes from a website called the Cult of Pedagogy, and it's written by Jennifer Gonzalez. And this is deep data at a glance. So just make this a bit bigger. This is the kind of thing that you could put in a register. So you've got your students' names down the side, and you're gradually starting to populate this chart with information about the students' passions, family, activities, all sorts of things. Now, obviously, you could put whatever you fancied in these boxes. You could adapt it. But this is what Jennifer Gonzalez refers to as deep data. Now, you can also use questionnaires and forms, such as this one, which you can find lots of this kind of thing on the internet. This is obviously a mock-up of a Facebook, sometimes known as a fakebook page. And here, this would be for a younger learner, asking the learner themselves to fill in a form. Something you should know about me is where they might like to sit in a classroom if you're not teaching online, some different preferences. And on this part of it, we've also got other information about the equipment that they might have available, their strengths, weaknesses, etc. And again, you could adapt this to the information that would be useful to your personal teaching context to be able to know a bit more about your learners. So you start to collect that data. What does that look like in real life? So I've just shown you sort of, here's a handout. Well, here's an example from a lesson that I taught. So this is one of my students. Obviously, their name's been changed to protect their identity. She was a teenager, and we're going to call her Steph. So I asked her to fill in one of those sort of fake book pages, and she's written some information. And you'll also notice there's a little bit of extra information here in pencil, which I've added. So I've looked up that her date of birth makes her an Aquarius star sign, because I know that I want to do a lesson on signs of the zodiac and the Chinese zodiac. I happen to look at what colors she might wear in school, because I might be able to put that into a little exercise that comes up. I look at who she's with in class and who she chooses to sit next to, because my students had the choice of where they sat. During one lesson, she was talking to me about an exchange she went on in Tokyo. So I'm gradually collecting information. And as the course goes on, as the term goes on, this sheet is going to get more and more full with little snippets of information that I collect about these students. And obviously got one for each learner. So what can I then do with this data? If I bother to collect it, well, I can really make things personal. So this is an example of a worksheet used with that same student and her class. And we were actually looking at the sort of theory of teaching, and we were talking about how you read things, looking at top down, bottom up. And in this case, I just simply changed the visuals. So these are books that one of the girls in her classes said, these are absolutely my favorite books. This is one of the girls' Instagram. I don't have to stalk her. I've just got the screenshot of the front bit. And straight away, as she's a teenager, going, oh my gosh, that's my Instagram account. Suddenly really engaged in the material. It's really personal. Writing some grammar exercises. There are pairs of sentences here, which my students were comparing. All of these are names of students in the class. And notice here I've got Steph, and she's in a sentence next to her friend that she's chosen to sit next to, Scarlett, and I've got some information that says Steph likes George, her brother. I know that her brother's name is George because I've collected that data. So that means that the exercises I'm doing in class are much more bespoke, much more personalized. They're not just out of any book, any worksheet. There's something that resonates with those students and helps me to show that I'm looking at them as an individual and therefore that I can personalize it. So what else can we do to differentiate, and what categories can we use? So we can differentiate our lessons because classes are not homogeneous. So we know sometimes schools put students in according to age. Maybe if they're in compulsory education and the state school system, you might have age, and therefore that's not going to be a differentiating factor. But if you have ability, I've taught abroad in places where I've had a 7-year-old and an 11-year-old in the same class because of their level of English, then that becomes my differentiating factor. I might know about their interests. Their current circumstances might lead me to choose particular material over another kind of material, or how far I'm going to stretch that elastic band. How far do I push them? Are they having a really tricky time at home and actually doing something a bit challenging is going to help them tune out? Or have they already got too much going on in their lives and just need something a bit less of a challenge? How ready are they to go to the next step? So all of these different things are things that we can choose to use as our decision-making keys for going on to choosing our differentiation. In addition to that, we've got to think and predict strengths and weaknesses. Now, if you are newly qualified, you may well have done a CELTA or an equivalent, or maybe you have been qualified for a while and you've done a Delta course, and you'll know that lesson plans include something very similar to this, or a version of, whereby you before the lesson anticipate the problems that are going to crop up and plan and think about what solutions. So this is going to be helping you to differentiate what problems a certain learner is going to have according to their knowledge, their ability, and those could be practical things. It may be that a particular child, this child is going to have a difficulty with an activity because they can't sit still for very long. Or this child's going to want to take the lead or speak out. So maybe I'm going to give them a particular role in a role play. If we're looking at linguistic problems and solutions, we can use resources such as this one. So Learner English is quite a well-known book, published by Cambridge University Press. It's written by Michael Swan, and each chapter has a different nationality. And that's really good if we're working with multilingual classes and we want to start predicting our strengths and weaknesses. And if we go back, that was our bullet point on the teacher standards. The second bullet point said that you need to have a secure understanding of how a range of factors can inhibit pupils' ability to learn and how best to overcome this. What you need to have the knowledge to be able to have the solutions to overcome those weaknesses. So let's say we've got all of this. We've now got to go and think about the main structure of our lesson, the main plan. And this takes me to my flexi-stage question on your reflective questions. So I'm asking again, don't get your phone out. Have you managed to not look at it? Brilliant if you've gone this far already. Don't Google anything. So we've got a couple of terms here that you may or may not be familiar with. The word lockstep means that everybody works on a task at exactly the same pace and speed. That does not allow for great differentiation because you're pulling all your learners through a point at the same speed. Plenary, if anyone hasn't come across this, is the whole class, open class stage. Now, this particular extract or excerpt is a little bit of a lesson plan. It doesn't really matter about what the lesson is about, but what's important is that this lesson plan has an optional focus. So it has an extra bit of support for those weaker learners. So if they're struggling, we're going to add in another phase. If they're not struggling and people are flying, we're going to skip that phase. And we've also got extension here, thinking about early finishers, doing another thing. So we've got a stretch task. We're stretching that elastic band, saying some of you can do a bit more, because if we don't differentiate, you're going to be bored or switch off. If we make it too easy, we lose engagement. If we make it too difficult, we lose engagement. So thinking about this right from the planning stage, adding in optional stages, or what we can call flexi stages or extra extension stages, gives people the chance to work at different speeds. So although they start in lockstep, they don't end this particular lesson in lockstep. Different people will be doing different things. So this is about our support and stretch. Now, if you haven't come across this, I would love to introduce you to something. And again, please don't Google it, but after the webinar, please do Google it big time. Barak Rosenshine is just a spectacular example of great education. So sadly, he died in 2017, and he was a professor in the Department of Educational Psychology in the States. I forget which university it was. I think it might be the University of Virginia. But he did a lot of research into maximizing student achievement through effective teaching. And he looked at how we can make our teaching really effective. And he came up with what is known as his principles of instruction, of which there were 17. Now, many people have since looked at this research and condensed it down into 10. So I'm going to show you those 10 now. I'm going to be quiet for a minute whilst you just read through these principles. So, notice some of the key parts of Rosenshine's work. And I'm sure this will be for another webinar, but one of them is about beginning lessons with a short review. So you can do this by using starter mats and including different information according to what a student needs. And it also goes full cycle that students are engaged in weekly and monthly reviews. And again, that can be differentiated according to need. A really key thing is he's saying that new material comes in small steps with lots of student practice. And there's a lot of questions. So for us, those are our concept checking questions, and we can differentiate. And he talks about checking the responses of all students. So not just calling upon the stronger learners, but actually calling on weaker learners, people that we think aren't sure. We spend a lot of time trying not to put our learners on the spot, but we've got to balance this with the knowledge of whether or not they've really understood and whether they're ready to progress. Thinking about our models, I very frequently watch teachers pull a model out of thin air without any context around it. And I think this comes from poor planning. So if you plan your lessons and really think about the context, you can make that model meaningful for the students. You can differentiate by looking at the difficulty of your models. And we're going to be thinking more importantly about scaffolding, because scaffolding is a big part of differentiating. So scaffolding, providing support for our students. So of these different principles, it really comes down to reviewing material a lot, questioning a lot, explaining and modeling, and providing practice. And all of these steps can be differentiated. Okay, so let's ask ourselves, do we have the same success criteria for all our students? What do we actually want them to learn? If we're going to be teaching in slightly different ways and adapting, surely we have to agree what the foundation, the basic knowledge is. And that is our core knowledge, the overall aim. So for each thing we teach, we need to know what is the most basic amount of knowledge that is acceptable for a student to understand before they can move on to the next step. And from that, we can then move outwards towards our extension tasks, where we build on that core knowledge and we get things more difficult, until we get really to our stretch tasks, where we're asking learners to really stand on tiptoes, that what they want to achieve is just out of their reach, and maybe they'll need our support. And we think about this, if we divide our students, many state schools talk about low prior attainers, middle prior attainers, and high prior attainers. So basically our low prior attainers are our weaker students. We need them to have the core knowledge. We need our middle prior attainers to have the core knowledge, and also our high prior attainers. That is key. But these second two groups are maybe going to get this more quickly, and we don't want them to stagnate. We want to move on. So we will be moving them through into the extension tasks. And for the really high flyers, the really capable or able students, or students who are already very familiar with that particular topic or task, we want to get them to stand on tiptoes, to stretch, so that they feel that they are learning something, that they're not just covering old ground again and again. So using the same model, but we're going to go completely in the opposite direction. Some of you may be familiar with ZPD, the zone of proximal development. So this is something which was proposed by a Russian guy called Vygotsky. He was a psychologist, and he did a lot of work into the development of children. And he looks at the distance between what children can do by themselves and what children can do with help, which is going to be more, obviously. And he's looking at the learning, what goes on. So he's basically, if you think of the analogy of a small child or a toddler, there are many things that a child can't do without help. They need some help. And with help, they can do it. And with help on many occasions, or that scaffolding, that support, they start to be in their zone of proximal development, whereby they're going to be stretching. It's a challenge, but a little bit of support from a teacher or from a peer, they're going to achieve more than what they could achieve by themselves. And eventually, with further practice, moving on to the independent practice, they get to something that they can do all by themselves. So we're looking at a model of progression from, I just can't do this by myself. I can do it if you hold my hand. And now I need you to let go because I'm flying and I'm ready. And then I can move on to the next step. Okay, so let's have a think about our next area, which is how we can scaffold. So I've got these lovely bricks here. How can we support learners? And this is not just our weaker learners, but also our stronger learners. So one way of supporting them is by planning and having extra models. So if we are teaching the third conditional, we don't just have a single model of the third conditional, but we have multiple versions of that model, looking at different examples of our target language. So extra models are going to help to scaffold, to provide support. We can rely on learners' peers or ourselves, the teacher, to offer support. One of my favorite techniques to help scaffold is using dual coding. So that means using the words with another code, the picture. A fantastic website, and again, please don't go to it now if you can resist, but the Noun Project, you can get for free loads of different little images, little cartoons and different things that can help you illustrate concepts that you want to get across to your learners, maybe through an interactive whiteboard or a handout. So this is something you can do. Graded tasks, we're going to look at this in a moment. Varying pace. I am sure all of us as experienced practitioners are used to varying the pace. We can feel in a room when things need to move faster or slower. That is harder to achieve online, absolutely. And that's why I really recommend, if you are teaching online, if you have any chance to insist on webcams on, that's really important because you can see the learner's face, you can see their engagement. If you can get them to use a chat box that you can see they're interacting with you, where they're at, you can then make decisions about how fast or slowly you move through material. You can think about what stretch tasks you might add, what choices you might give. And this can go back to that slide we had with the different colored balls. Those choices might be based on preference, interest, ability, readiness. And we'll look at toolkits and help boxes in a moment. So these are all different ways of scaffolding. Now, one thing I'm sure that many of you do is thinking about grouping. So how can we group mindfully to really think about the individuals in our class? Well, one thing, if you're online like we are right now on Zoom, never use the assign automatically box for a breakout room, because that means that you're going very randomly with which students are grouped together. You want to make a purposeful choice as a teacher. In this task, do I want my stronger students to be together, helping one another, stretching, maybe going on to something extra? Would I prefer to have a weaker student with a stronger student, or a student with brilliant prior knowledge of the topic with somebody who knows nothing? So think about how you group in order to access the maximum peer support. If you're in a physical classroom, think about the seating plan. My pet hate is rows of tables that cannot be moved. Unfortunately, some places you have absolutely no choice. But if you have choice, don't be lazy. Move your desk. Make groups. This is you, the teacher. Think about how you can monitor around the group. Do you want to be over here working with this group because they need you? And this is the lesson in which this group needs that extra teacher support. Have you got this group with peers sat next to each other who are going to help one another? So think about where people are placed, both online or physically in a classroom. And then think about the actual framework of how you teach. Now, have a look at this. You might notice I like marbles. So the big red marble again is us, the teacher. So in a gradual release model, this is a model for presenting language. It's not dissimilar to PPP, presentation, practice, production, which many of you may be familiar with, but it's looking at those stages. So if you're presenting something new, a piece of grammar, vocabulary, or pronunciation for the first time, you're going to start with you modeling what you would like learners to know. And this is the core knowledge will be happening in this teacher support phase. So it's all about you. Then you're going to start getting people interacting with you. So you and the pupils. So if it was pronunciation, you might be doing some choral drilling, some back chaining, the whole class and you working together. You might pop in some extra models. So when you've done that little presentation and you've done some practice in the safety of a group, then you want to break people out into those smaller groups. And this is where the students work together with their peers in small groups. And you, as that teacher, if I go back to this slide, you can move at this point. Okay, so you can move from one group to the other. So this group might need your support. So in you move. This group doesn't need you. Maybe these two groups would work together. And then the other phase, so this is the I, we, you model that it's sometimes called as well, is the second you. So English is annoying. We've got you singular, you plural. We need to, if we're going to get real progress, we need to give a student a chance to work completely by themselves. And in our communicative model of teaching, we very frequently go for pair work, group work, do it together. Even when we're writing, we write together because one person has ideas, the other person is a secretary, writes them down. That does mean that we can't see individual progress, and we can't be sure of how that is working. So we do need a phase where students work all by themselves. And in this phase, they may need the help box, which we will see in a moment. Okay, this next slide is where you really need a pen and paper. Okay, so what I would like you to do for this one is you're going to do a little task. You do need your paper and you need your pen. And this is a mini version, an excerpt of a dictation, which is of a much longer text, but I'm just going to dictate a very tiny bit at the beginning. So the text is a story, and the title of the story is What a Day. And as you can see, I've got a picture of an alarm clock on the screen because it's to do with time. So I'm going to make this smaller. Now, what I'm about to do is I'm going to reveal the one of the tasks. So this is a graded task. So different students would receive different tasks. So I'd like you to, first of all, do this task, which I'm about to reveal. So you're just going to be jotting down the answers on your paper. So this is the task, and it says, underline the mistakes you hear and try to correct them. Okay, so you might want to just cast your eyes over that task. I'm going to read the dictation, and hopefully you'll be quickly aware that there are some differences in what I say and what you can see. So here we go. What a day. My alarm clock didn't sound, so I overslept. I got up at 9 o'clock with a terrible toothache. I suddenly remembered I had an appointment with the dentist at 9:45. I ran out of the house and down the road. Okay, so that is version 1. And hopefully you've got some words on a paper. So if you're with my students, I would be giving you some more time over this. That would be fine. So I'm going to just delete this one away. And I'm going to minimize this so that you can see the next version. So I'm going to do it exactly the same thing. I'm going to read the text again. And in this case, what you're going to do is complete the gaps. So what are the missing words that go in here? So another piece of paper, or further down, another task. I'll repeat the text one more time. Okay, here we go. What a day. My alarm clock didn't sound, so I overslept. I got up at 9 o'clock with a terrible toothache. I suddenly remembered I had an appointment at the dentist at 9:45. I ran out of the house and down the road. Okay, so hopefully you've got those words on a piece of paper. Now, the third version of this dictation is this. So in this case, the students receive a handout which says, keyword text, use the keywords to make notes. So now you've got the keywords. More of a challenge. I'd like you to make some notes next to those keywords. So I'll read it for the third and final time. What a day. My alarm clock didn't sound, so I overslept. I got up at 9 o'clock with a terrible toothache. I suddenly remembered I had an appointment with the dentist at 9:45. I ran out of the house and down the road. Okay, having looked at these three different tasks, so we've got the keyword, we've got the gap fill, and we've got the factual error, you will notice that these tasks have different levels of difficulty. So I, as the teacher, read exactly the same dictation to everyone. But my weakest students are possibly just looking out for single mistakes. So here they're going to change this from 10 o'clock to 9 o'clock, and headache to toothache, and doctor to dentist, and 9:45. So they've got 4 things to listen out for in that section. Slightly stronger students are going to be challenged to fill in the gaps, and the frequency or length of gaps will again dictate how difficult that is. So you can differentiate this many times over. And far harder is just having keywords and making notes. Now, what I really love about graded dictations is you can have any number of different tasks. So you'd start with the original text, and you can change and grade the difficulty. But what's really nice is when you come to the feedback stage, your stronger student in that breakout room or in class can be paired with a weaker student. And the weaker student actually has far more information at their disposal than the stronger student. So the stronger student is going to need to rely on the weaker student in order to get some support. And so I think this is a really nice example of how you could differentiate in class. And it's not actually a big effort for teachers, because once you've got your original text and your original rubric, so the instructions, you can just chop and change, delete bits out, cut and paste, and very quickly make different worksheets. So that's an example of a graded task. Okay, let's think also, we're moving through our learning, and we need to think about how ready we are. Now, you may or may not use Cuisenaire rods in your teaching. But one thing I like about this, which I've used with my students sometimes, is if you have a box of Cuisenaire rods, you can even just use the rods to represent a traffic light. So I might put on my desk a red rod, and I'm showing the teacher, please slow down, please stop, you're going too fast. Or today I don't want a really difficult task. I'm finding things, I've got enough on my plate. Maybe I put an orange rod on my desk, and I'm saying, I think I understand, I'm not 100% sure, might need some clarification. I'm kind of happy at the middle pace of the lesson. Or maybe I'm placing a green rod on the front of my desk saying, give me more. I want to go really fast. I've completely understood this. Putting this rod on the desk is telling you that I could teach a friend what you've just taught me because I get it. You may recently have seen there was a webinar on differentiation by Cambridge University Press, and a guy called Simon Lind, who is a consultant and educator, presented things, and he talks about using traffic lights. Particularly, I liked his idea of using them in the chat box where he's teaching, and he will literally ask students to type the word red, amber or green after a task to tell him stop right now, repeat this, I don't get it. Or let's just slow down a little bit. Maybe we'll do another model, or I'm ready for you to move on. So he's asking his students for direct feedback on their learning and where they are at. Another way of getting direct feedback from students is thinking about getting them to self-assess. So this is a piece of writing done by an 11-year-old. Actually, my son did this at the end of his primary school, and he was asked to write a little piece about Remembrance Day. And he was then asked to assess how well he'd done that. So in order to assess how good you are at something, you do need some information. Now, one thing is using a toolkit like we've got here. And this is the information that he had. So he can ask himself before he writes and after he writes, am I going to plan my paragraphs? Did I plan my paragraphs? Oh, yes, I think here I can see clearly 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes. Do I have my facts right? Did he Google it? Did he check that? Yes, this is the date. Those are the correct dates for the war. This is the correct spelling. Has he checked his commas and full stops? And importantly, because we want to get to a higher grade descriptor, has he, in this case, used a passive, like poppies are worn? Well, he's got straight away in the first line, Remembrance Day is held. So tick box. So he gets to tick all of those. And then can he really assess? So what does the teacher ask? This is in primary school. So the teacher uses what is known as a WALT. So they're saying to the class what we are learning to. So we are learning to understand the significance of Remembrance Day. And the teacher uses a WILF. He tells the children what he or she is looking for, what I am looking for. So this teacher, what they're looking for is children who can recognize key information and events, accurately use nouns and proper nouns, and explain how Remembrance Day is important. So my son, Max, is able to look at this and say, have I done this? Have I done this? Yes. He can say whether or he got feedback from the teacher, in this case, no. And he can indicate whether he did that all by himself, in a pair, or with somebody else. Did he have stretch support? Was he independent? So having that tailored thinking about how you assess and what you include helps to differentiate. And then the teacher can look and think, well, which children were able to do this or not able, and how much do we need to repeat this? And this toolkit can be different according to the needs of a child, how much extra stretch or how much support you want to provide. Okay, we can also look at what the feedback that the teacher provides. So again, using an example from my son, this you might notice a common theme here. They were doing a block of work about the First World War. And this is the first half of his writing. And you'll notice that there's some pink highlighter pen and a little bit of green. And here's a second part. And again, pink and green. Now, don't worry too much, pink and green. So if I just zoom this out, we then get the teacher's feedback. So the pink, wow, Max, I absolutely love your writing. The atmosphere and emotion you create is excellent. And your use of vocabulary through action is fantastic. And then we've got that little green point. Just check your use of commas. They're missing, or there should be a conjunction. So the teacher is indicating what went well, or the even better if. So even better if next time you pop a comma in here, I hated them dark, comma, that's the only reason. Then it would be perfect. But what went well? Look at this fantastic colon and semicolon. Congratulations, Max. So giving some tailored feedback to a child, just using pink and green. And you can do exactly this with adults as well. You can walk around the room as well and just make little colored points on people's work and say, can you share with me if you've got a green mark? I'd just like to share a point that's useful for the whole class, a work on point, or maybe it is just private to that particular student. So this has really been a whistle-stop tour of some practical ideas for differentiation. So what can you take away from this? Well, I've kind of got two final takeaways. Well, number one is just go back through this webinar, Google the things you wanted to Google, pat yourself on the back, congratulate yourself if you didn't look at your phone, or do that during the time you've been listening to me speak. But my gradual reveal on these two statements, the first thing is we can't meet everyone's needs all the time. As a teacher, that is not physically possible. We know that. but we can meet needs over a series of lessons. So if we look at a longer plan of lessons and we have lots of information about our students, knowledge about their progress, their problems, then we can look at, which lessons are going to support certain students better, or some students on some occasions, they're not going to get the maximum. I think that's an unrealistic expectation. And the second thing is, think about things being personalized. Think about things being tailored to a particular individual and that class. Don't go for the lockstep for too long. Try to break out of that so that you can have a flexible framework which helps support individuals. And if you just bear these two key points in mind, I think that you can really start to make steps into differentiation. So just lower your expectation of yourself. Some teachers feel, I've got to change everything, I've got to adapt everything, I've got to write 100 lesson plans. No, you don't. You can't do that. You can't keep your sanity doing that. You need to take small steps over a longer period of time and just start small with that personalization and with that tailoring. In my opinion, differentiation is a mechanism for all students, and that is the key about differentiation. So yes, you want to catch the weaker ones, so you want to add in the extra support. Yes, you want to challenge the stronger ones, so you want to put in that stretch, that elasticity, that band I was talking about. But you can't then miss out all the people that are in the middle. So differentiation is supposed to include every single learner in the class, and therefore you need to spend that time. And that's why I say it can't be necessarily achieved in every single lesson, but it can be achieved over a series of lessons. So it is about all students, not just weaker or stronger. I think that teachers do need training in that it is useful to see good practice. It's useful to see other people doing things. But very often you've got to do it yourself to learn a technique. So having seen me do a little mini graded dictation, perhaps you've got a flavour, a taste of how that could be. Try it with your classes. Try it once, twice, 3 times, and then it becomes part of your own teaching repertoire. And then you have trained yourself in the use of a single differentiation technique. Certain things like personalisation, I really believe should be automated. It should be automatic to make things as tailored and as personal to learners as you can possibly manage at all stages, because that increases engagement. There are other things that you could look at, and certainly I would refer you back to the Rosenshine and his principles of instruction. There are loads of sub-skills within that, like the concept questions, how we question to stretch and support. And that, I think, can be done via training. So good modeling and somebody who has experience in that. In order for differentiation to be successful in a physical classroom, you need movement. So preferably both teachers and students, you need to be able to create workstations. You need to be able to physically move your chair as a teacher, or just get out of your chair, walk around the room, get behind students, get next to students, kneel down near students, move people, get a student that's finished some work to go and support another student. So there, you do want an element of physicality if that is at all possible. In the online classroom, again, it's about that use of breakout rooms and also using the chat box to differentiate. So that's less of a physical accommodation, but you can accommodate your learners by using the technology mindfully.